Okay, I think we can get started here. Hi again, this is Andrew at the 10YFP Secretariat. I just wanted to very quickly let all of you know a few of the ground rules, which you probably already do from participating in these kinds of events. You'll see that your microphones are muted. However, we do want this to be as interactive as possible, and there'll be time for questions and answers. So please feel free to use the chat function, and we'll gather those questions together and pose them to the panel afterwards. So without any further ado, I am going to introduce the moderator of this session. Jorge Laguna Celis is the head of the 10YFP Secretariat. So Jorge, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And at the outset, let me welcome all of you, friends, participants that are joining this World Resources Forum 2021 that is being held under the title A Green Deal for Sustainable Resources. We are very proud as the One Planet Network and the International Resources Panel to be program partners of this WRF forum of this year, and to host this online workshop, which you can see the title. It's about the value chain approach, a tool for prioritized action on sustainable consumption and production. I will be the moderator for this session, and I am extremely excited, extremely engaged to be with a wonderful panel of experts, practitioners, and policymakers that will be sharing with you some of the experiences that we have learned in the last year in adopting this value chain approach. Let me start, as a matter of fact, without by not losing any time, because my goal as moderator is not only, it's twofold. One, to ensure that we keep time, but the second is to ensure that you as audience, to all the participants that are following and are engaged in the World Resources Forum, that we get the maximum time for hearing your questions, your thoughts, and ensuring that you can get the insights from these excellent panelists that we have gathered today. I will start, as a matter of fact, by introducing my friend and my colleague and co-convener of this event. Her name is Ms. Marilyn Van Voor. She is the head of the International Resources Panel Secretariat. The International Resources Panel, as you know, is the foremost authority on resource use. It's a institution hosted proudly by the United Nations Environment Program, but it brings the leading experts in the world that are guiding policymakers in terms of resources use. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to you, Marilyn, to provide welcoming remarks on our behalf.
Thank you, Jorge. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, perfectly well, loud and clear.
Perfect. So colleagues, as Jorge said, this is a session that is extremely important, I think, for us as people who we wear clothes, we consume food, we buy, we do online shopping, Amazon. I'm sure all of you have Amazon accounts. And the reason why I'm starting with that introduction is to make it a little bit more personal and real. So this session is about the value chain. And essentially it is about how do we understand what happens from the point where we purchase something and where it lands in our houses or our apartments or wherever it is that we live. So in short, the pieces of clothing that we purchase online and maybe in person goes through a series of steps. And I've thought about it personally, what that means for me. And what that means for me is I've become much more aware about the fact that there's a process which is production. So that's the source, materials. And as Jorge says, that's the mandate of the IRP. So where do we source our materials from to deliver the goods and services that we have? Then there's also the people who make our goods. And then finally is what happens when we receive it. And I suppose after that, what happens when we no longer love your favorite scarf or your favorite piece of furniture? And I want to make it that personal because I do think, Jorge, that this is really at the heart of the matter, this issue of value chain. And I don't want us to get lost in the jargon. I think the jargon is very, very important. And if we are to take this agenda, which is really related to sustainable development, seriously, I do think that we have to put it in those terms as I've tried to describe, which is what happens when Merlin buys a t-shirt on Amazon or she goes to a shop on Amazon. Why do we want to take it seriously, Jorge and colleagues, is because the RP has actually done the data when it comes to what happens with regards to resource extraction. And we have shown that in order to produce certain of our materials account for almost 90% of biodiversity, but also water stress. And I think most importantly, it also impacts on human health. We also have data that shows that despite our best efforts to move towards what we call a more resource efficient economy or circular economy, we are not quite there. And the RP has tried to make the case for what we call decoupling from economic growth, from environmental degradation. And we are not there, to say the least. And the numbers tell us that if we were to continue practicing the way we are, in terms of the way we manage our economy, we will probably reach a level of 110%, if you can believe that, increase in resource extraction, which amounts to about 190 billion tons. And I don't like putting out numbers without context, but I think you can appreciate that those numbers are huge. And so, Jorge, I think as you facilitate this discussion today, and like I said, take the jargon away. This is about the value chain approach, but this is also about what happens when you purchase that T-shirt. Understand what it means, what happens when you purchase a particular product. And that's why the work that the International Resources Panel, together with your initiative, under your leadership, Jorge, which is the 10-year framework program, is so important. And I think the way my message is, how do we shift our consumption, but more importantly, our production systems? Thanks, Jorge.
Thank you, Marilyn, for those words, for making it personal. Absolutely, that is exactly what we want to do today. It is, how do we translate on a very specific set of tools, on a very specific set of actions, this value approach, to ensure that not only we make visible for producers the amount of resources that are being consumed, we show pathways on how to reduce those resources in order to produce the same products, but also addressing from the point of view of consumers the aspect of changing completely the paradigm of overconsumption. But if we don't have data, if we don't have an approach, it all stays in the discourse. So I think that you're setting a wonderful ground for a discussion today. And now we're going to have a very short but very concise presentation from Maria Jose Baptista, who is connected with us. Maria Jose, she's a program management officer precisely within the International Resources Panel Secretariat, and she is going to share with us light on what is this value chain approach as a methodology and why is it important? Why does it matter? From also, consider it from that personal perspective, from that business perspective. We will hear it later on from that institutional perspective in our panel discussion. So, Maria Jose, over to you.
Thank you, Jorge, and hello, everybody. Let me try to explain very briefly what we mean when we say the value chain approach. And maybe let's start by saying that if we really want to produce information that helps us understand how the management of natural resources and raw materials can actually support more sustainable consumption and production, then we need to understand those natural resources in relation to the economic activities that for which they are used. So economic activities can include stages like extraction, processing, manufacturing, distribution, and they require obviously natural resources, water, land, etc., but also material resources like metals, fossil fuels, and they will result in a set of environmental impacts, but also on a set of socioeconomic impacts as shown here on the slide. Now, using this lens, we can apply the so-called value chain approach, but let me start with the very basic. What do we mean when we say value chain? A value chain is comprised by all activities that provide and receive value throughout the life cycle of a product or a service. So from production to disposal. And it also includes other elements like business plans, investments, stakeholders. The concept is really broad. It considers socioeconomic context within these products and services, as well as systemic and structural emphasis, such as the legal systems in which they operate, financial systems, regulations, policies. And they are not just a supply chain or life cycles. It's really a broad concept. And the key stages of a value chain will normally include extraction, processing, packaging, distribution, marketing, retail, consumption, waste management, disposal, and after use. Of course, these stages will vary depending on the sector we're talking about, on the product, or on the location. So what is the value chain approach? The approach is really a methodology to try to catalyze science-based policy action on sustainable consumption and production. And it really looks at identifying key points of intervention within economic systems to try to reduce natural resource use and the environmental impacts caused by production and consumption, and to try to maybe define a common agenda actually for action within a particular value chain. As an action-oriented approach, it has some key outcomes. It helps us identify where the greatest opportunities for improvement are. It helps us identify actions that need to be promoted to take advantage of these opportunities. It helps us create, or look at what are the enabling conditions that are needed and the stakeholders that could lead such actions. And it includes 3 basic steps, and you have them here on the slide. The first step is understanding the value chain and identifying key hotspots. And this is basically trying to carry out an in-depth analysis of that value chain. It's defining what are the stages of that chain. It's mapping where the natural resource use is occurring and the environmental impacts as well. It's trying to apply a systems approach as well to understand the drivers, barriers, feedback loops that drive the behavior of the actors within the different stages of that value chain. And through this first step, we will get to key points of intervention. The second step is really trying to look at what is being done already. So mapping existing activities of different SCP actors, from governments to UN agencies, civil society, academia, private sector, along the different stages of the value chain, and trying to see, comparing the action with the identified key points of intervention in step 1, and trying to see where more action is required, where sufficient action is already taking place. The third step is trying to define a common agenda and prioritizing action. And this is done through a multi-stakeholder consultation with a diverse set of actors representing different stages of that value chain. And during those consultations, basically the analysis from the first and second steps are discussed to try to understand those key points of intervention, as well as the gaps and opportunities for action, and define a common agenda for concerted action that may transform the system. And let me go very quickly through some of these steps, just as a matter of example of what we are talking about. In the step 1, when we first try to understand, what is happening, we need to look at, for instance, the example you have here on this slide is actually the mapping we did of natural resource use along the food value chain. And what this slide shows is that by synthesizing available data along the value chain, it is possible to understand what activities require more resources. In the case of the food value chain, you can see that most of the resources and the environmental impacts occur actually or come from the primary production stage. And then next slide, well, the mapping of resource use and impacts along the value chain shows what is happening at different stages. Applying a systems analysis shows us why it is happening. And here you have on this slide the drivers within the construction value chain. It helps us categorize or group these drivers in these 8 main categories, where we can look for data to try to understand how these drive the way in which the value chain in the construction sector works. And so from demographics to market forces, social norms, or building codes, financial access to housing, all of that is really looked at within that same, within this step. Next slide, please. Then we have also the identification of the so-called hotspots. And what we do, for instance, here in this slide you have, is also from the construction value chain. And basically most of the resources you can see there are used during the material production, the actual construction activities and operation of the buildings. But key decision-making is done not by these actors, but by people working on the design, planning, commissioning step, or by actors who provide the finance for those activities to occur. So this is the kind of analysis that we can do in step 1. Step 2 will be more about identifying who is doing what. So next slide, please. And this will help us understand what initiatives are already addressing, the key hotspots that we identified, and maybe need just further coordination for greater impact, and what are the major gaps in addressing or understanding the key hotspots and trade-offs that were identified and that need maybe particular attention. This example on the slide is actually the mapping of initiatives across stakeholder groups from the One Planet Network on the food value chain. And you can visualize very clearly here which solutions exist, but also maybe some clear gaps that in terms of tools or initiatives or policies, and what is, for instance, the step of the food packaging and processing stage, for instance. This is the kind of analysis that is done during the second step. And the third and final step is about defining a common agenda. Next slide, please. This common agenda helps align the action from these different actors, agree on a shared vision, and then it's undertaken through a participatory process engaging different actors across the value chain. The example you have here on your slides was the outcome of some consultations done for the textile value chain. that helps bring together actually action from different stakeholders from that value chain. Next slide. And final one. I think this value chain approach can add value in different ways because it is holistic. It helps us map actors, it helps us map processes, it helps us map drivers. It is also systemic. This means that it will help us understand how the value chain operates within a system and how certain actions actually shape the operations at different stages of that value chain. It is also reliable because it is not only about the environment, it is about the people and the economic activities that they undertake and their behavior. It is actionable because it enables policymakers to actually prioritize their efforts by identifying these key impact areas. And finally, it is replicable. It is really a framework for a methodology that can be applied to different sectors, different products, and different locations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria Jose, and for providing these really two concrete examples, not only of the methodology, but also on how it applies to two key sectors that we can spend the whole day discussing. One, it's on the food value chain, the other one on the textile value chain. Those are very, very engaging sectors. But from my perspective, what I've learned is that it's also quite more complex. And now we're going to hear from Jesus. Jesus, he is, I'll introduce Jesus Alquezar. He is a socioeconomic analyst at the European Commission and a task group member of this wonderful work that we have been doing. And we thought it would be very interesting to provide you with this institutional perspective, if only because the EU is working on a very ambitious policy package. That's the Green New Deal. And the value chain approach can be a way to help you define your investments, right? To help you define the investments that the EU can do in making, in moving the European societies and the business community towards a more circular and a sustainable path. So, Jesus, I have a question for you. From your perspective, what recommendations from the task group report are more useful for the European Union, and how could they support the implementation of the various policy areas that are being considered as part of the European Green New Deal? Over to you, Jesus.
Yes, thank you very much, Jorge. Thank you very much, Maria Jose, for this presentation. In fact, you anticipated already what I planned to say. So, as you say, you very well explained, Jorge. Now, the top priority of the European Union is the European Green Deal. With the European Green Deal, for the first time ever, the Commission or the European Union aims at tackling our three environmental and existential crises. So climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, and all driven by resources depletion, as we know, notably through the IRP reports. These policies, this big ambition wants to be systemic and consistent, coherent. So all policies have to contribute to these goals under the so-called do not harm principle. What does it mean? That we have really to assess if one policy do not harm any of the objectives. We cannot solve, for example, climate change if we are damaging biodiversity loss or resources depletion, or resources conservation. These are really the pillars of this European Green Deal. As you can see, to follow this systemic approach, what this systemic approach brings is complexity. So it's much more difficult to develop and to implement policies under this logic than under the more silos approach of the past, where, okay, I work on climate, I work on climate. I work on energy, I work on energy. This guy works on biodiversity, he works on biodiversity, but we don't see the interactions. And in the past, we had very negative examples in the Commission. I'm not going to enter into details of policies that, with the best intentions, at the end were damaging, for example, biodiversity or natural resources. So for me, the big added value of the value chain approach is indeed to facilitate the implementation of this systemic approach. So it helps to understand and to design and develop the policies in this systemic manner, making them also more efficient, because we can identify the key points where we can have a bigger impact. So this is really the added value that I see for of this value chain approach. To simplify or to conclude, really it gives clarity to address problems that are increasingly complex. Thank you very much.
And I think it's important that we have seen already this methodology and understand that, yes, it helps us, I would say, approach from a systemic perspective, but also simplify the way the decisions are made. I mean, there's these two elements: the simplification, but the complexity and the simplification. I was really struck by the food value chain approach analysis, Catherine, because as we saw there with Maria Jose, most of the resources impacts are done at the production stage. Yet once we dig a little bit deeper, the decisions that are impacting that production stage are made elsewhere in the value chain, right? And sometimes from a pure approach, simplistic, we would say, okay, let's invest in changing the mentality of the farmers. Let's work on the production stage. Yet maybe that has not always been the correct approach. We need to look at the consumers, we need to look at the packagers, we need to look at other stages that are making this systemic connection. But you are an expert on this, and you can really shed light from the food systems approach. Where are the hotspots? Where are the interventions that we should replicate if we adopt what we hope so as a community, this value chain approach? Over to you, Catherine. You are the manager for sustainable economies, our WWF, a great partner of the sustainable food program under the 10YFP, but also a leading organization on this specific track. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you so much. And yes, I was the lucky one, and I got my example to be shown in the presentation. As you said, within the food system, most of the impacts are really being felt at the level of the smallholder or the primary producer. And in fact, with WWF as well, this is where a lot of the action has been focused in the past. And we can see now, after some decades of trying to reach smallholders, that it's insufficient just to target them as a group. We cannot achieve food systems transformation by working only with smallholders, or even by working only with consumers, for instance, on their food choice behavior. So it's clearly necessary to have a look at the entire value chain, especially the middle part, as you mentioned, where some of those value is concentrated. And in the food system, that starts with processors and traders, and it ends with sort of retail and food service industry before coming to the final consumer. So a value chain analysis like the one described here is useful for pointing to those actors in the middle of the chain and seeing where the impacts are, but also where sort of the power and value consolidations occur, which is where we can focus our efforts. When we're designing interventions now and in the future, it's important to investigate ways that allow us to sort of shift that power and value back to primary producers, or rather to keep it in those producing regions, who in many cases are sort of losing the natural capital value of their own landscapes and neighborhoods through unsustainable commercial practices and the pressure to produce unsustainably in order to maintain their livelihoods in many cases. And as you mentioned, as a single primary producer, it's much more difficult to have the ability to just shift your mode of production, and it's a lot easier if we're talking about large traders and processors who have a significantly larger share of the value for them to sort of support those transformations. So as the value is sort of being transferred through this global commercial chain into the hands of these processors and retailers, we will be focusing our sort of value chain analyses in the future on how to keep more of that value in the hands of producers and producing regions. And this was one result of a study that we have worked on earlier this year, also with One Planet Network. And another issue that we see in this work and another result of the study was that while a lot of these different approaches have been tried, we know that application of an intervention is not the best metric of that intervention success. We need a lot of impact research to be done on these interventions as well. Some of the information on impact is pretty thin on the ground, and the information baseline that a value chain assessment like this can provide is really a prerequisite to doing that impact and efficacy research further down the line. So it's not only in prioritization of points of action where a value chain approach can help, but also in that data gathering that we need to create impact assessment to prioritize further approaches. And finally, with the way that this topic has taken off in the past decade, and especially with the WWF, we see it very, very often that there are multiple attempted interventions taking place within a single value chain. So usually we'll have maybe a retailer on one end who's trying to influence their consumers into purchasing a more sustainable product line. And on the far opposite end, you'll see a jurisdictional approach, which is trying to address sourcing from a producing area, which is undergoing deforestation. So a value chain approach here can really help to pick up those missing links, especially, and see those actors who are not yet being addressed or who haven't begun to take those steps necessary to support the initiatives on the other sides. And so that could be a really big help too. So yeah, we really see a lot of applications of the value chain approach for practical work, but also a lot of use for evaluation and analysis as to what is most effective and where we still have gaps. So thank you.
No, thank you, Catherine, for breaking down the value chain approach for the food sector, and we will come with some follow-up questions because we will have time for discussion. But we have our third perspective, and this is the business perspective. It's Rijit Sengupta. Rijit, you are the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO of the Center for Responsible Business in India, and you have also been part of this exercise. So what I would like to hear from you, and I think it's interesting here, it is what is the value chain. It's originally a concept that originated from the private sector, but how does this methodology that we are working can help guide better decisions from businesses to really reduce their environmental impacts and shift their economic models towards a circular approach? What are the lessons that you have learned in your specific context there in India?
Thank you very much, Jorge, and to the IRP for inviting us. I'm going to split whatever I'm going to say in two parts. First 2.5 minutes, I'm going to talk about why I think that the glass is half full. And the second 2.5 minutes, I'll say why do I feel that the glass is half empty as far as the value chain approach is concerned. COVID, I think, I'll probably be repeating what several hundred people have said, that COVID has really highlighted that it can't be business as usual, which is cliche. But what we are also hearing closer to the ground is that the terms like resilience and inclusivity are being talked about by businesses much more than they were earlier. So that's great news. That's great news for the value chain approach, because if you're talking about resilience, especially in international trade and business, where businesses are cross-jurisdictional, cross-geographies, and complex and tortuous deep value chains and supply chains, the risks often lie deep in those value chains, various layers, the tiers that we refer to them. And the value chain approach really provides an opportunity for businesses to identify those risks, because we are not just looking at the business suppliers, but we are also looking at a wider ecosystem of all those actors and stakeholders who add value and context and support the movement of goods and commodities. So whether it is, as Marilyn was saying, whether it is in terms of textiles or what Jesus has done on construction, or Catherine and her colleagues have done on agriculture, but on other sectors also, like mining, like forest-based commodities, so on and so forth. So the application is very sort of universal, and businesses are realizing that that potential of the value chain. The other good news, and which Maria Jose talked about, is that the value chain approach also provides a framework. I mean, businesses know what they're doing, right? They know that their businesses are, their operations are closely related to resource use and the impact on the environment. So that's nothing new. But what is new, perhaps, is that they have a framework to understand the nature and the magnitude of those dependencies and those impacts. So that's probably the freshness that the value chain approach applies. The other positive and the freshness about the value chain approach is the focus on the stakeholders, and it's not part of any other methodology that you emphasize so much on the stakeholders. And this was something that we had discussed at length at the task group, that we are not just talking about the movement of goods and commodities, but we are also talking about people here, right? So we have to understand those interrelationships between those tiers, those contexts, the culture, so on and so forth. So that also is another freshness. And I'm coming to the end of my 2.5 minutes about why I feel the glass is half full. And the last point about why I feel the glass is half full is also because of the fact that it also relies on systems approach. The emphasis on systems approach, whatever amount of emphasis we provide on the systems approach is little, because it's critical. And I think very personally at an organizational level at CRB, we feel that the businesses of the future are going to be systems champions, and that's also emerging very, very, very fast. But now that I've taken 3 minutes, I have just 2 minutes on why the glass is half empty. I think the glass is half empty because we now have the methodology, but what about uptake? What will enable uptake of the value chain approach among businesses? And that's where I think we need to focus now, that the work has been already developed on the methodology. And there are 4 points that I'm going to share here in the next 1.5 minutes that I've got. The first is, what is going to be the trigger? What will push a company to say, well, here is a methodology and let's apply it? We need to think about those internal and external triggers. Secondly, especially now, especially in this part of the world, the developing countries, emerging economies, where post-COVID recovery is critical, is there a business case? Can the value chain approach help businesses come out of the the post-COVID in a better manner? Thirdly, where is all this support going to come from? Who's going to provide capacities and support to those businesses which raise their hand and say, well, we are going to be able to do it? And mind you, this is not a tool only for MNCs. This is a tool for all businesses. So we are talking across different countries and different regions. And last of all, a lot of colleagues have talked about the fact that, it has to be engagement across the value chain. And we believe very, very that there is a need for an equal, balanced partnership and collaborative approach, which is needed. Otherwise, this will also become a tool to arm twist the upstream and at the cost of several other issues. So I think it is critical that a balanced conversation happens, and the application of the value chain approach is taken through a partnership and a collaborative manner. Thanks. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rijit. No, those are absolutely wonderful points. And some of the questions that we're receiving are building and are addressing those key issues that you have mentioned. We have exactly 10 minutes and we are getting really, really good questions. So if we cannot answer all of them in these 10 minutes, then for sure, I would request a little favor some of our experts, that is to answer them after this event closes. But I have picked, thanks to the great help of Andrew, who has moderated the chat, 3 questions. I will start and I will read them. So please listen, my wonderful panelists. The first one, it has been raised by Titis Abdini. Titis Abdini. And this one, it's going to be for you, Rigid, but you're going to answer it on third place. It is, how do we make sure that the value chain approach is made correctly, including all actors and stakeholders? And maybe I'll give you 1 minute and 1 minute to Maria Jose, who's connected to give us an insight on this key point. How do we verify? How do we make sure that the approach is it's correctly done? Then the second one, it is from Ila Nodeker. And this one is for Jesus. Jesus, she's asking very specifically, does the systematic or the systems approach of the European Commission also cover economic and agricultural policies? And you referred to some of these in your example, and she asks, so how do we break down the silos, not only at DG Environment, but also DG Grow, DG Agriculture? What's your experience? You'll have 1 minute and a half for this very complex case, but I think it's very interesting to make it a little bit more concrete. The third question that I picked, it's a very interesting question that was posted anonymously, but it's interesting and I have kept them, and it's addressed to Kate. So Kate, question from the audience is, you mentioned the importance of going beyond interventions which target only the producers. Similarly, would you agree that interventions must look at how to shift the burden of sustainability away from the producer to other actors? We've heard that, you've mentioned it. But the question it is, does WWF have experience in this type of interventions which share responsibility along the value chain, right? I've given you time a bit to prepare as I was reading them, because I think that that it was fair. So let me start with Maria Jose, giving you 1 minute to how do we ensure that the approach is done well? What's your advice? It goes to the uptake as well that Richard was mentioning. You have 1 minute.
Thank you, Jorge. Yes. I think that for us, when we try to apply it to we actually have tested it with construction, food, and textiles. And it is important, I think, to follow the steps that the approach establishes, and identifying, really defining what are the different stages of the value chain you want to include. That will set the tone to what data you are going to look at. So I think that's a very critical step in the whole process, because that will also give the boundaries of the actors that you will also call on for the third step to this multi-stakeholder consultation. And I think, yes, the very pragmatic approach is following the steps, but really thinking, giving a lot of thought to the first actual step of mapping these different, within that value chain, what are the stages? Make sure that you really cover, all of the stages of that value chain.
Thank you. Now I will go to Jesus. If you could elaborate, I think that's an interesting question.
Yes, indeed.
In the agriculture.
Indeed, this is a very, very good question. So, in principle, these do not harm, and this aspect of making policy systemic applies to all the services of the Commission or the European Union. But as you can imagine, in a big administration, and the European Commission is a very big administration, you always find resistances to change, policy inertias, etc. So very often, and it's really practically my day-to-day work, you have to remind to colleagues, don't forget about biodiversity, don't forget about resources, don't forget that this is also an objective of the European Green Deal. Don't focus only on, let's say, energy or climate or whatever. The case of agriculture and the common agricultural policy is probably a negative example that shows how we needed already this value chain approach decades ago. So you know that the common agricultural policy has been a disaster ecologically. So this is not a secret for anyone. Of course, it was created decades ago when the objective was completely different. We were not focusing on environment. We were focusing on ensuring the security of supply of food, and the environmental concerns were completely out. But this shows how we created some incentives that are very difficult to remove now, that led to an environmental problem historically. So again, we see this inertia of policies. It's very difficult to change support schemes or legal, so the legal background from one day to the other. So it takes time. And finally, a third element is also that in the Commission, but I think it's the same in member states, as you can imagine, every administration, every directorate general or department has its own stakeholders, and also they are more close to some member states than to others. And of course, these stakeholders defend very often the status quo. Not everyone is convinced about the need to change, or they want to postpone it. I see, however, very good examples when we talk about industry. So the traditional stakeholder of DG Grow, the European industry is already very, very focused on the circular economy and resource efficiency. Not necessarily for environmental reasons, more to guarantee the supply of raw materials. But this is an example on how an administration that traditionally was completely out of these policies is now very, very focused, and is now indeed an ally in many dossiers
And is that in all
of DG
sectors?
Environment.
Is it the entire, you say
the
industry?
Sorry.
I just want to understand if it's all sectors.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you
But it's
so
easier
much.
in some than in others, let's say.
Of course, and that's exactly why we are proposing this value chain approach, and the key point of the uptake is central. And we believe that the Green New Deal, it is absolutely transformative in the potential that it can have. So thank you, Jesus, for sharing that insight. Now, Kate, over to you. Maybe in 1 minute you can share one example where WWF has shifted the approach from one sector to the other in the value chain. Over to you.
Absolutely. So first of all, I just have to say I totally agree. We need to shift the burden of sustainability away from these primary producers, especially in agriculture. And I know we're talking about the value chain approach, but just a small plug for another kind of approach, the landscape approach. This is a type of approach which WWF is using a lot in our producing landscapes, where we involve all stakeholders, corporations, as well as, of course, the smallholders and the people who are living in a landscape and producing in a landscape, to help improve the landscape sustainability. This is really one of the approaches that we see as having the most promise in this area of not only creating those lessening those natural resource use impact and environmental impacts, but also for preserving and promoting livelihoods. So there's a lot of work to be done, but this is one of the approaches that we see as having a lot of promise for that. So.
And Rigid, you will almost have the last word, because I would like you to just build on this idea of how can we engage more stakeholders. And you talked about the uptake. So you have 1 more minute to build on that. How do we ensure that we bring more stakeholders on board?
No pressure on me, Jorge. I think the private sector and many of us have used the word stakeholder mapping very loosely. While engaging stakeholders, I think we don't really know who our stakeholders are, and we often use the word very, very loosely. So I think the good part of the value chain approach is that it provides us a tool and probably reminds us that the stakeholders are really going to be critical in the value chain, in understanding the value chain, whether they are small farmers or downstream retailers, financial institutions. Some stakeholders we haven't really even included in our analysis or in our site. So I think the value chain approach is a good reminder that do your homework well, map your stakeholders well, because that will ensure that the value chain is more robust and resilient. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that. Those closing remarks, Rigid. On my side, what I take of this debate, it is first of all that the value chain approach, it's a very robust methodology, but that it requires uptake, right? It requires absorption. It requires use. And one of the key areas which we have to be building, it is on building those correct cases that we can ensure and reassure stakeholders that yes, it is a tool that can help them do better, more sustainable business, and to stakeholders to really track the policy processes in a more coherent, in a more efficient manner. So it works for the institutions, it works for the business, it works for the consumers, it works for the civil society organizations engaging, but it needs uptake. And so we have to keep on investing on that. That requires resources, that requires support, transfer of the knowledge of those stakeholders that have adopted it towards those stakeholders that need convincing in adopting, and that's the key point of Regit. The European Union has great examples. Now we need to transfer those examples to other countries, to other regions, to really ensure that we move globally towards achieving the decoupling that Merlin reminded us at the opening of this event. So we, within the IRP and One Planet Network, we will continue to work this year and next year in ensuring the uptake. I think that's the key point, the uptake, the translation, the collection of stories, and the cross-regional and cross-sectoral dialogues, so that we can come back at the next World Resources Forum with rather mapping the uptake of this value chain approach. And that, I think, it is the key component that we have now, that we have agreed that the methodology is useful. We just want to thank all of you, our wonderful panelists that have lent their time. We will answer the questions that are remaining in the chat. If we have your contacts, we will share them with you, or through social media. We will definitely answer those questions. And let's keep engaged. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Regit. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Maria Jose. And thank you, Merlin, and to all of you, our appreciation. Let's stay engaged, and the best of luck for this World Resources Forum 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.